The smell hit me before the cup even touched my lips. It was faint, almost polite, but unmistakable bitter almonds. My stomach tightened instantly. At my age, you learn to trust instincts more than logic. Instinct had kept me alive through widowhood, loneliness, and the exhausting task of raising a child who wasn't born to me, but became my entire world. Monica stood across the kitchen island, smiling the way she always did, soft, practiced, reassuring. She had perfected that smile over decades. It was the smile of a devoted daughter, a loving wife, a woman who had nothing to hide. "Drink it while it's hot, Mom," she said gently. "I made it special for you." I nodded, lifting the mug slightly, pretending to enjoy the warmth in my hands. But something was wrong. Very wrong. David, her husband, had stepped away to use the restroom, leaving his own mug untouched on the table. 3 mugs sat there, mine, David's, and one Monica had poured for herself, but hadn't tasted yet. That alone was strange. Monica was usually the first to drink. I excused myself, saying I needed sugar from the pantry. My hands trembled, not from age, but from a deep, crawling fear I couldn't explain. As I turned my back, I quietly switched the mugs. Just a small movement. No sound. No drama. When I returned, Monica didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and didn't care. 20 minutes later, the screaming started. It came from the kitchen, sharp and animalistic, slicing through the calm of the afternoon. I rushed back to find David collapsed on the floor, his body jerking violently. Foam coated his lips. His eyes were wide, unfocused, almost glassy. "He's dying," Monica screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Mom, help him, please." I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break through my chest. I was 67 years old, and in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The drink hadn't been meant for David. As the paramedics arrived and worked frantically, Monica's cries filled the room. She clung to me, sobbing into my shoulder. Anyone watching would have seen a devastated wife and a frightened daughter. But I wasn't watching her tears. I was watching her eyes. They were dry. Too dry. One of the paramedics asked what David had consumed. "Hot chocolate," I replied automatically, then corrected myself. "He drank hot chocolate. I didn't finish mine." "Who prepared it?" he asked. There was a pause. "My daughter," I said quietly. Something flickered across the paramedic's face before he wrote something down. David was rushed to the ambulance, barely alive. Monica insisted on collecting the mugs, but I stopped her. "I'll do it," I said firmly. In the kitchen, I examined them carefully. The mug that had been meant for me was empty. The one David drank from had residue, thick, clinging to the bottom. The third mug, untouched, had an oily film floating on the surface. I poured each into separate containers and slipped them into my bag. As I followed the ambulance to the hospital, memories began replaying in my mind. Memories I had buried, explained away, forgiven. Monica had come into my life 30 years earlier, a frightened little girl with pale hair and oversized blue eyes. She had survived a fire that killed her parents, or so I was told. She was 5 years old, silent, broken, and in desperate need of love. I gave her everything. Therapy, time, protection, my entire heart. I ignored the warning signs. The dead cat, the poisoned fish, the neighbors who fell mysteriously ill, the men she married, older, wealthy, who died too conveniently, leaving everything to her. I told myself I was being paranoid. At the hospital, Monica clung to me again. "What if he dies?" she whispered. "I can't live without him." For the first time, I didn't comfort her. Instead, I asked calmly, "Monica, what did you put in the hot chocolate?" Her face changed for less than a second. A flash of something cold. "Calculating. Chocolate. Milk. Sugar," she replied. "Mom, you're in shock." But I wasn't. I was awake. And as doctors confirmed cyanide in David's system, I realized the truth I had avoided for 3 decades. I hadn't raised a damaged child. I had raised a predator. And I was next. As I sat alone in the hospital waiting room, the beeping of machines echoing faintly down the corridor, memories I had buried for years began to surface with brutal clarity, forming a single long chain I could no longer break. Monica's story had always been tragic, or so I believed. A little girl pulled from the ashes of a house fire, no relatives willing to take her in, a social worker desperate to find someone stable. I had been lonely then, still grieving my husband, aching for purpose. When I saw her sitting silently with her hands folded in her lap, I didn't see danger. I saw a child who needed saving. From the beginning, she was unervingly calm. Other children cried, screamed, demanded attention. Monica watched. She observed people the way others might study puzzles. When she smiled, it never reached her eyes, but I told myself trauma showed itself in strange ways. I defended her to teachers when they complained she showed no emotion. I paid for therapy when she lied without blinking. I explained away the small incidents, the classmate who became suddenly ill after sharing lunch with her, the neighbor's dog that died mysteriously after Monica had been seen feeding it treats, the way she reacted to pain in others with curiosity instead of concern. Each time, I chose love over suspicion, because admitting the truth would have meant admitting I had made a terrible mistake. As she grew older, she learned how to perform emotions perfectly. She learned when to cry, when to hug, when to say exactly what people wanted to hear. Men fell for her easily. Wealthy, older men who liked to feel needed. The first husband died of what doctors called a sudden heart failure. The second slipped in the shower. The third never woke up after a late-night drink. I attended each funeral, dressed in black, holding her hand while something cold twisted in my gut. Still, I said nothing. I told myself coincidences happen. That grief makes people imagine patterns where none exist. That a mother protects her child, no matter what. Sitting there in that hospital, waiting to hear if David would live or die, I finally understood the cost of my silence. Love had made me blind. Fear had kept me quiet. And now, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of losing my daughter. I was afraid of what she might do next. I realized then that if David survived, she would see him as a mistake to be corrected. And if he died, she would move on, untouched, already planning her next step. As nurses walked past me and the smell of disinfectant filled the air, one thought settled heavily in my chest. I had spent my life protecting Monica from the world, and in doing so, I had failed to protect the world and myself from her. The hours that followed stretched endlessly, collapsing time into a single suffocating moment where fear, guilt, and clarity tangled together inside my chest. I sat in that hospital chair staring at the pale green wall, replaying every moment of my life with Monica as if my mind were desperately searching for proof that I was wrong, that I had misunderstood her, that this was all some terrible coincidence. But the truth pressed in from every direction, unrelenting. When the doctor finally came out and told me David was alive but critical, something inside me shifted. Relief should have washed over me, but instead there was dread. Survival meant questions. Questions meant investigations. And investigations meant Monica would feel threatened. I knew her well enough to understand what that meant. When Monica returned from the restroom, her face was carefully arranged into grief, red eyes, trembling lips, hands clasped tightly together. Anyone else would have believed her completely. I once would have too. But now I noticed the details I had always ignored. How quickly she checked the hallway before sitting beside me. How her crying came in waves that stopped the moment she thought no one was watching. How her questions were never about David's pain, only about whether he had spoken. She leaned toward me and whispered that everything would be okay, that the doctors would fix this, that we would go home soon. The word home echoed in my mind like a threat. I realized then that I could never go home with her again, not without risking my life. The hospital called the police quietly, professionally. They asked questions gently at first, then more precisely. Monica answered without hesitation, her story perfectly rehearsed. I said very little. I had learned, far too late, that silence could be dangerous, but used correctly, it could also be a shield. When an officer asked about the mugs, I handed over the containers I had hidden in my bag. My hands were steady for the first time that day. Monica noticed then. Her eyes met mine, and for a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. There was no fear there.
No panique.
Only calculation. In that instant, the bond one had clung to for decades finally shattered. I was no longer her mother. I was a witness. The realization was devastating. I mourned not just the woman Monica had become, but the child I had believed she was. I mourned the years I had defended her, the lives possibly lost because I couldn't bear to face the truth. As officers stepped away to make calls, Monica leaned close and whispered my name, her voice low and sharp. She asked why I was doing this. She told me I was confused, tired, imagining things. She reminded me that I was all she had left. That sentence once would have destroyed me. Now it only hardened my resolve. I looked at her and said something I had never said before, that I knew. I didn't accuse. I didn't shout. I simply said I knew what she was capable of. Her face went completely still.
No tears. No anger.
Just a faint smile, almost respectful. That smile frightened me more than any scream ever could. At that moment, I understood that she had never loved me, not in the way I understood love. I had been useful, a shield, a cover, a means to appear normal. When the police returned and told her they needed to ask more questions downtown, she didn't resist. She kissed my cheek lightly, as if saying goodbye before a trip. Her lips were cold. As she walked away, I felt an unbearable mix of grief and relief. I had failed her as a mother, but I had finally done something right as a human being. Sitting alone once again, I accepted a truth that would follow me for the rest of my life. Monsters are not always born in darkness. Sometimes they are raised in warm homes by people who love them too much to see the danger growing quietly in front of them. And sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is stop protecting her child and start protecting everyone else. The days after Monica was taken in for questioning felt unreal, as if I were moving through someone else's life, watching events unfold from a distance I could not close. I returned to an empty house that no longer felt like home, every room echoing with memories that now carried a different meaning. The photographs on the walls, birthdays, graduations, holidays, looked like evidence instead of nostalgia. Sat alone at the kitchen table where I had once watched her sip hot chocolate as a child, remembering how carefully she had always observed me, how she learned my routines, my habits, my weaknesses. Back then, I thought it was attachment. Now I understood it was study. Sleep abandoned me completely. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Every shadow felt alive. I kept replaying our last conversation in my head, the calm certainty in her voice, the cold intelligence behind her eyes. It terrified me to realize how close I had come to being another quiet headline, another unfortunate accident, explained away by bad luck. The police called often, asking about Monica's past, about incidents I had once dismissed as coincidences. Each question felt like a blade cutting through years of denial. I told them everything, the animals, the husbands, the lies, the moments that never quite made sense. Speaking those truths out loud felt like confessing a crime of my own, and perhaps it was. Silence can be a crime when it protects the wrong person. The detectives listened carefully, taking notes, exchanging looks that told me my story confirmed their suspicions. Toxicology reports came back. The residue in the mug contained traces of cyanide, diluted but lethal. David had survived only because of the accidental switch. That knowledge haunted me. I imagined the alternate ending, the one where I drank that cup, where Monica stood over my hospital bed with the same dry-eyed concern she had shown for David. I wondered how many times she had practiced that scene in her mind. The press never learned my name, but whispers spread through our community. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Some pitied me. Others blamed me. I heard the unspoken question in every silence. How could you not know? I asked myself the same thing every night. Love, I learned, can be the most dangerous blindfold of all. When Monica's attorney contacted me, requesting that I speak on her behalf, I felt something inside me finally break. For decades, I had been her shield. I refused. That refusal cost me the last illusion of motherhood I had been clinging to. She sent a letter from Holding, a carefully written thing, full of apologies that never named what she had done, full of concern for my health, full of reminders of our bond. I read it once and burned it in the sink, watching the paper curl into ash. I understood then that closure would never come from her. It would have to come from me. David survived, but he would never be the same. When I visited him, he thanked me with tears in his eyes, calling me his guardian angel. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full truth, that the danger had lived in his home, shared his bed, smiled into his face. Some truths are too heavy to carry when you're still learning how to stand again. The investigation moved forward quietly, methodically. Patterns emerged. Evidence accumulated. I was told my testimony would be crucial if the case went to trial. The thought terrified me. Facing Monica across a courtroom felt like stepping into the mouth of a storm. But I knew I would do it, not out of revenge, out of responsibility, for the people I could not save, for the years I had wasted explaining away the unexplainable. Living with the truth was harder than living with denial, but it was also cleaner, sharper, honest. I began therapy, something I should have done decades earlier. I learned how deeply guilt can root itself into the body, how it manifests as sickness, fatigue, fear. I learned that forgiveness does not mean absolution, and that forgiving myself would be the hardest task of all. Each morning, I forced myself to open the curtains, to let light into a house that had been darkened by secrets for far too long. I told myself that surviving does not always feel like triumph. Sometimes, it feels like grief wearing the mask of endurance. And yet, beneath the weight of everything I had lost, there was a fragile sense of purpose taking shape. I could not change the past. I could not undo the damage Monica had caused. But I could stand in the truth now. I could refuse to be silent ever again. And as terrifying as that path was, it was the only one left that felt like life. As the investigation moved forward, my life became divided into two parts: the years before the truth and everything that came after it. Each day brought new revelations, small details from Monica's past that aligned too neatly with tragedies I had once dismissed. The police uncovered patterns I had refused to see: insurance policies taken out shortly before deaths, friendships that ended abruptly after illness, quiet arguments with people who later vanished from her life. With every discovery, the weight on my chest grew heavier. It was like watching a carefully constructed illusion collapse brick by brick, revealing something dark and deliberate underneath. I was asked to come in for multiple interviews. Sitting in those sterile rooms, answering questions about my own child, felt like being torn apart slowly. The detectives were respectful, but their eyes held the same unspoken truth I could no longer deny. Monica had been dangerous for a very long time. They asked me why I never reported the earlier incidents, why I stayed silent, why I defended her so fiercely. There was no simple answer. I told them the truth, because I loved her, because I believed a mother's job was to protect, because admitting the truth would have meant admitting I had failed to stop something terrible from growing under my roof. At night, the guilt became unbearable. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by memories and what-ifs. I saw every moment differently now, the way she watched reactions instead of feeling them, the way she mirrored emotions instead of expressing them, the way she learned what people wanted and became exactly that. I realized she hadn't just learned to deceive others. She had learned to deceive me most of all. And I had allowed it because it was easier than facing the alternative. The community's reaction was another quiet punishment. Some people reached out with sympathy, others with thinly veiled judgment. A few old friends disappeared completely, unable or unwilling to reconcile the image of a loving mother with the reality of what had happened. I stopped trying to explain myself. There are some truths that sound like excuses no matter how honestly they're spoken. When the prosecutor explained that my testimony could help prevent future harm, something inside me finally steadied. For years, I had been frozen by fear of losing my daughter. Now, I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed silent again. That fear outweighed everything else. I agreed to testify. Preparing for that possibility was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I rehearsed my words with lawyers, learning how to speak clearly without emotion, how to stick to facts instead of memories. But emotions don't disappear just because you ask them to. They live in the body, in the pauses between sentences, in the tightening of the throat. Every practice session left me exhausted, but also strangely lighter, as if telling the truth, even in pieces, was slowly draining the poison I had carried for decades. I received one final letter from Monica before her access to communication was restricted. It was shorter this time.
No apologies. No explanations.
Just a simple message telling me I had betrayed her, that everything she was came from me, that whatever happened next was my fault. I stared at those words for a long time before folding the paper and putting it away. For the first time, they didn't wound me. They clarified something instead. She was still trying to control the story, and I was finally refusing to play my part. David continued to recover slowly, his health permanently altered. When he thanked me again, calling me brave, I felt an ache I couldn't name. I didn't feel brave. I felt late. Late to see. Late to act. Late to protect. But I also knew that acting late was better than never acting at all. I began to understand that love without accountability is not kindness, it is negligence. That realization hurt more than any accusation anyone could make against me. I had loved Monica with everything I had, but I had not held her accountable. And that failure had consequences far beyond my own life. Standing in the quiet of my home one evening, I looked at the empty chair across from me and felt something close to acceptance settle in. I could not rewrite my past. I could not reclaim the years I spent protecting the wrong person. But I could choose who I would be now. I would be honest. I would be accountable. And I would never again confuse silence with love. That decision didn't erase the damage, but it finally gave my life direction again. The day I stepped into the courtroom, I felt like I was walking into a life I never agreed to live. The wooden benches, the echo of footsteps, the quiet authority of the judge's seat, all of it made the reality unavoidable. This was no longer a private nightmare confined to my memories and regrets. It was public now, spoken aloud in a place where lies struggled to survive. When my name was called, my legs trembled, but I stood anyway. I reminded myself that this moment was not about me alone. It was about everyone who had been harmed because I stayed silent for too long. As I began to speak, my voice sounded unfamiliar, steadier than I expected, yet heavy with years of restraint. I talked about Monica as a child, about her intelligence, her charm, and the way she learned early how to read people. I described the warning signs I ignored, the incidents I brushed aside as misunderstandings, the excuses I made because admitting the truth would have shattered my idea of motherhood. With every sentence, I felt layers of denial peel away. The courtroom was silent, but I could feel the weight of every word landing, undeniable and permanent. The defense tried to paint me as confused, emotional, unreliable. They asked why I hadn't acted sooner, why I continued to support her for so many years. Their questions were sharp, designed to wound, but I answered honestly. I said I was afraid. Afraid of losing my daughter. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of what it would mean to accept that the child I raised was capable of such cruelty. Saying it out loud was humiliating but also freeing. For the first time, my fear was no longer controlling the narrative. When I looked at Monica, she didn't look back. She sat perfectly still, her expression carefully neutral, as if observing a performance rather than living inside its consequences. That hurt more than anger ever could. In that moment, I understood something vital. The person I had spent decades protecting had never needed my protection. She needed boundaries, and I had failed to give them. After my testimony, I left the courtroom exhausted, as though I had aged 10 years in a single morning. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, almost forgiving. I didn't feel victorious or relieved. I felt honest. And that honesty, though painful, felt like the first real step toward peace. In the weeks that followed, I began therapy, something I had avoided for years because I was afraid of what might surface. Those sessions forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, about how my identity had been built around sacrifice, how I confused endurance with virtue, how I believed love meant never walking away. Slowly, I learned that love can also mean letting go. It can mean choosing truth over comfort, even when that truth dismantles everything you thought you were. I also started to reconnect with parts of myself I had abandoned. Simple things, reading without distraction, walking in the evenings, cooking meals just because I enjoyed them. These moments felt almost rebellious, as if I were reclaiming a life that had been on hold for decades. Healing, I learned, is not dramatic. It is quiet and repetitive, built through small choices made consistently. David visited me once, bringing news of his continued recovery. He told me the trial had given him closure, that hearing the truth spoken openly helped him finally release the anger he carried. His forgiveness was unexpected, and I didn't feel worthy of it. But I accepted it anyway, understanding that forgiveness is not something you earn. It is something others choose to give, and something you must learn to give yourself. As the verdict approached, I prepared myself for any outcome. Justice, I realized, does not always look like punishment alone. Sometimes justice is exposure. Sometimes it is prevention. And sometimes it is the quiet certainty that the truth will no longer be buried to protect a lie. I went to bed one night knowing that whatever happened next, I would no longer live in denial. I had spoken. I had chosen honesty over fear. And even though the cost was high, it was a price I should have paid long ago. For the first time in years, I slept without waking from guilt. The verdict came on a quiet afternoon, almost anticlimactic in how ordinary the day felt. No thunder, no dramatic shift in the sky, just a judge reading words that would permanently alter several lives. When it was over, I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, trying to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something heavier and calmer at the same time, finality. Monica was led away without looking back. I thought I would feel a surge of emotion in that moment, anger, grief, or even regret, but instead, there was a strange emptiness. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already mourned the daughter I thought I had. That grief had happened quietly over many years, long before a courtroom confirmed what my heart had been afraid to accept. In the days that followed, the world expected me to move on, as if life could simply resume its previous rhythm. Friends offered well-meaning advice, neighbors spoke in careful tones, and some avoided me altogether, unsure of what to say. I realized then how isolating truth can be. Lies often keep people comfortable, but honesty forces everyone to confront their own assumptions. At home, the silence was the hardest part. No more phone calls filled with tension, no more excuses to defend, no more constant vigilance. Just quiet rooms and the echo of my own thoughts. For the first time in decades, my life belonged entirely to me. That freedom was unfamiliar and frightening. Therapy became a lifeline. I began to understand how deeply I had tied my self-worth to being needed. I learned that I had spent so long protecting others that I never learned how to protect myself. My therapist helped me see that boundaries are not betrayals. They are acts of self-respect. This realization didn't erase the past, but it gave me a way to live with it. I also began volunteering at a local support group, quietly, anonymously, listening to others who carried stories of betrayal and misplaced loyalty. I didn't offer advice. I simply listened. And in listening, I found something unexpected: connection. Pain, when shared honestly, loses some of its power. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't happiness in the traditional sense. It was acceptance. Acceptance of my mistakes. Acceptance of my limitations. Acceptance of the fact that loving someone does not mean sacrificing your moral compass. I don't know what the future holds. I don't pretend that everything is healed or whole. But I know this. I am no longer living in fear. I am no longer silent. And I am no longer defined by the choices of someone else. The chapter that closed in that courtroom was painful, yes. But it also made space for something new. A life rooted not in denial, but in truth. Time has a way of changing the shape of pain. It doesn't erase it, but it dulls the sharp edges, turning something unbearable into something you can finally carry. Months passed after the verdict, and slowly, the world stopped asking questions. The headlines faded. The whispers quieted. What remained was me, alone with the truth, but no longer crushed by it. For the first time in decades, I wasn't reacting to crises or protecting someone else's secrets. I was simply living. I learned how to build a new routine, one that belonged only to me. Mornings became sacred. I opened the curtains and let the light in, no longer afraid of what the day might reveal. I made tea instead of hot chocolate, a small but deliberate choice, and sat by the window watching people pass by, ordinary lives moving forward. There was comfort in that ordinariness. It reminded me that life continues, even after it breaks you. The guilt didn't disappear overnight. It returned in waves, often triggered by memories I couldn't control. A child's laugh in a grocery store, a familiar song, a photograph tucked away in a drawer I hadn't yet found the courage to open. But I stopped fighting the guilt. I learned to sit with it, to acknowledge it without letting it define me. My therapist taught me something I wish I had known much earlier. Responsibility does not mean lifelong punishment. Accountability can exist alongside self-compassion. I began speaking, carefully, thoughtfully, at small community gatherings, never naming names, never dramatizing the past. I spoke about denial, about how love can sometimes become a shield for harm when it lacks boundaries. I spoke about the danger of silence. People listened. Some cried. Some thanked me quietly afterward. I realized then that my story, painful as it was, could still serve a purpose beyond regret. At night, when the house was quiet, I allowed myself to grieve fully, not just for Monica, but for the woman I had been before fear shaped every decision. I grieved the years I spent explaining away my instincts, the moments I chose comfort over courage. That grief was deep, but it was also honest. And honesty, I learned, is the foundation of healing. I stopped asking myself who Monica might have been if things were different. That question had no answer that could bring peace. Instead, I focused on who I could be now. A woman who tells the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. A woman who understands that love without limits can become dangerous. A woman who finally learned that protecting others should never come at the cost of one's own moral voice. There are days when loneliness still creeps in, quiet and persistent. But it no longer feels like punishment. It feels like space. Space to breathe, to reflect, to live without fear of the next disaster. I fill that space with simple things. Books, long walks, conversations that don't carry secrets. These small joys are not loud or dramatic, but they are real. And for the first time in a very long while, real feels enough. I don't know how history will remember my choices, if it remembers them at all.
But I know how I live with them now.
I live honestly. I live awake. I live without pretending that love excuses harm. This is not a story about triumph. It is a story about responsibility, about the cost of silence, and about the quiet strength it takes to finally choose truth, even when that truth changes everything. And that choice, painful as it was, gave me my life back.